Welcome to this webinar on fall garden planning. Happy to have you here and excited to share what I think is probably the most impactful topic for most gardeners. Even if you've gardened for years, a lot of gardeners, they plant a garden in the spring, harvest in the summer, but they um, don't do a fall garden. And fall gardening is actually one of the best ways you can increase your overall production, crop production in a given year, and grow more food for your family. So excited to share this information with you to help you grow more food. My name is Jason Matthias. My wife Shannon and I have 7 kids. Our oldest is 17 now, and our youngest is 6.5. You may have seen me before in any one of a number of different online training events or different conferences. I love doing these trainings. I've learned a lot in my lifetime of gardening and love sharing it with others. So hopefully you may have seen me in one of these before, and I'm glad to have you back for this webinar. Our business, Seeds for Generations, is all about sharing our family's love for heirloom seeds and gardening and with families like yours, and to help equip others to grow more food. I grew up in the garden. I grew up in Southern California where there's a long gardening season, and before I could walk, I was in the garden munching on fresh produce right off the vine. So we've been doing that same with our kids and teaching them skills of self-reliance and appreciation for where food comes from, how challenging it is to grow sometimes, and how to be able to provide for their families when they grow up. If you haven't been with me before for a training, a little bit about my background. I was an Air Force pilot. I flew KC-10 air refueling tankers way back in the day, and spent a lot of time overseas after 9/11 especially. My last assignment on active duty was actually working with the Army as a liaison officer with the 10th Mountain Division. I went to Afghanistan on the ground with them twice, and I really enjoyed the many very interesting things I got to do and places I got to see in the military, but I was just gone far too much. And as we started having kids, it was going to get even more time away. As you rise in rank and responsibility and leadership positions, you tend to move around a lot more and be gone more. So I decided that's not really what was best for my family, and we left active duty. And I went into the reserves. I retired a few years ago from the Air Force Reserves. And the Lord providentially placed us in the mountains of Virginia, west of Roanoke, and our homestead here we've been at for a few years now. We took over this homestead from another family that we met when we first moved here over a decade ago, who unexpectedly had to move, and we're continuing the legacy that they started. And they did a really great job in setting things up and having a lot of thoughtful systems in place. And I'll tell you what, it's a huge blessing to be growing a garden in a garden that has had soil that's been improved year after year for 20 years. So we got a tractor a couple of years ago, which is a huge help for a lot of the heavy lifting chores around the farm and the homestead. Every spring we get out in the garden with the kids and prep the soil and get the potatoes planted. It usually is one of the first crops we get in. This time of the summer, we're harvesting cucumbers, picking potato beetles off the potatoes, and we're almost to this point, and I think this was from a previous August, but we're almost to this point with our tomatoes, and they're just coming ripe now. So the tomato tsunami, which is what I affectionately call it, is soon coming to our farm. I would love to see some clouds like that on our horizon. We've had almost no rain the past 3 weeks, so we're in a bit of a drought and everything is drying up. And although I have irrigation in place, it sure would be nice for our grass to be able to grow, for our sheep in particular. The kids love harvesting fresh veggies from the gardens. Green beans and tomatoes are some of the favorites. In the fall, we harvest longer season crops like sweet potatoes and potatoes. We're starting to harvest our onions as well, and garlic. And in a few weeks, our porch will once again look something like this, where we have tons of tomatoes to process and lots of other things, everything from tomatillos and beets to winter squash and apples too. Apples are coming soon. So we're very blessed to live in the place that we live and do what we do. And our family business gives us the opportunity to really focus a lot on growing, not just to provide for a family, but also to, help apply a lot of the lessons we've learned over time and then share them with you in forms like this. So hopefully this is going to be helpful for you. And our family really just wants to thank you for taking the time to join us and help try to implement some of the things that we've learned over time. So let's get started. Let's do a quick overview of fall garden planning. Basic categories or things I'm going to cover. I want to start with some assumptions. There are some assumptions that go into how I'm tailoring this training, so I'll talk about those. Considerations for you to think about when you're planning your fall garden. Some planning factors that you have to determine, and variables that you have some control over. So we'll start with the assumptions. The first assumption is that you're already gardening this year. In other words, you're not starting a new garden for the fall. A lot of this stuff will still apply to that, but I'm going to try to talk a lot about things that you can do with the assumption that you already have crops in the ground and that you're going to be, planting in spaces maybe that are open, or maybe adding some new space, but not that it's a completely new garden like this. So you're not starting a new garden. However, I will say, if you do have space to start a new garden, that often is easier for the purposes of planting a fall garden, because you kind of have a blank slate or a clean palette to work from. And some of the constraints you'll face if you're planting in an existing garden will not exist. So, and the last assumption is that you want to grow more food. I mean, the main reason to plant a fall garden is you can grow more food for your family. So that is an assumption. And I often do these webinars. I'll talk about some of the why. Why should you be planting a fall garden? I'm just going to assume that you know that it's important for you to grow more food, especially this year. We're over a year since the massive disruptions in the food system last spring and early summer, and it's a lot of those cascading effects of that have continued throughout the food system over the past year. And this past 18 months or so has shown more than ever, in some very dramatic ways, why everybody should try to be growing more of their own food and not be dependent and reliant upon just the industrial modern food system. So some considerations, basic categories that I'll be talking about here. We're going to talk about soil, garden location, sunlight, temperature, and your season length. And then we'll talk about some other things after that. So first, your soil. First thing is, a lot of people ask me, well, my stuff doesn't grow that great. What can I do? Well, it helps if you know what you are aiming for, so that you know how to compensate for whatever deficiencies you might have. So qualities in an ideal gardening soil would be a high organic matter content, balanced pH. In terms of the soil structure, a sandy loam is ideal. There's sand, loam, and clay are the three basic makeups of soil. A sandy loam is kind of the ideal mixture of components and type of structure. If you lack anything, a good rule of thumb for just about any situation is add more compost. So if you can add organic matter, particularly good organic finished compost, as you plant, that is really going to help. What we often do, even though we have good soil in many of our growing spaces, in particular in areas where we're using a landscape fabric as a geotextile mulch on the ground, we have holes in that landscape fabric that we plant things like broccoli or peppers, and we'll basically lay that down, and then we'll use an auger bit that goes on a hand drill and basically drill out holes to plant in. Then we plant in, and we add a scoop of finished compost into the hole, and then transplant our plant into that good organic matter, and that really helps the roots get established and the plant to thrive and take off. So if you're doing like starting from seed, often you're going to dig like a furrow, or maybe use a row planter or something. If you're digging a furrow, we'll often add a little compost in it and then plant the seeds in that, or we might dig a furrow, plant the seeds, and then cover it with compost. You can basically kind of top dress with a little bit of compost, and then as it rains, it'll take the good stuff in that compost and push it down in the soil. So if your soil needs more help, I'd say put it down in the soil and plant in it. If your soil is pretty good, but you want to add organic matter, you can kind of add it on top. So it depends on your situation. A really important thing is that you want to mulch well. This is particularly important in the fall as the temperatures drop and as you go into winter. When I talk about fall gardening, a lot of this stuff really applies to like growing into the winter. The colder it gets, the more wind you have, the more insulation is beneficial for your plants to help them deal with temperature swings and particularly extreme temperatures. So if you can get wood chip mulch in particular is one of the best things to mulch with. That is very good to help retain moisture, help provide some insulation to the plants against more extreme temperatures, even for crops that are more cold tolerant, like brassicas and similar crops. So let's talk about your location. The two main factors in terms of where you want to grow, particularly in a fall garden, are sunlight and wind. So the angle of the sun changes in the fall and into the winter. So shade might be an issue. You may not have shade problems in your garden plot in the summer because the sun is high in the sky. But as the sun gets lower in the sky later in the year, trees or buildings may cause shadows. And so it's really important to have full sunlight for as much of the day as possible for pretty much any of your fall or winter crops. So make sure that you take that into account, the pattern of sunlight changes. Another thing is that wind can drop temperatures significantly. So you want to look for wind blocks, such as tree lines that provide shelter against prevailing winds. For most people, the winds are prevailing out of the west. Here in the mountains of Virginia, they're like kind of southwest to west to northwest. In the winter, they tend to be a little more northwest. We actually have a tree line that has a wind block that's over on the northwest side of where our kitchen garden is and some of our buildings to help shelter some of the buildings from wind. But in particular, where we're at, our microclimate is a lot more like northern Pennsylvania because, in part because of the wind, we get a lot of wind, especially in transition seasons like the fall, and it will lower the temperatures quite a bit. The wind chill that's created can actually end up leading to damage to the plants, and so you want to take that into account. If you can have natural wind blocks, that helps provide some buffer for them. However, you may need to use some season extension methods like plastic, like you see in this picture, which I'll talk about later in the presentation, as well, to also protect them depending upon their level of frost tolerance. Space available is always a factor. For most people, they don't necessarily have a huge garden space and they wish they had more space. Generally speaking, it's better to do more with a smaller space rather than just expand your space. It's better to be more efficient in the space that you have to use rather than expand the space. So you want to take that pattern of sun exposure into account. And also, if you're doing like a new garden plot, maybe, I don't know if you've used row gardening before or maybe square foot gardening, but the space you have may inform whether you use one type or another. A lot of people use row gardening if they've got larger spaces. If they have smaller spaces, a lot of times they'll have raised beds and use like a square foot gardening method. So it really depends on like what you have. The other thing that may inform what kind you have is irrigation. So we use drip tape irrigation, and that kind of lends towards a row gardening setup, though you obviously can use that in a raised bed with a square foot gardening setup as well, as long as the drip tape is getting, or soaker hose or whatever you have is providing moisture for your plants in the spacing that they have. So sunlight, that's where all the energy for the plants comes from. So some factors to consider for that. The soil with more sun stays warm the longest into the fall and the winter. So a south to southwest facing slope are going to be the warmest. They're going to stay the warmest the longest in the year. So if you are positioning a new garden plot, take that into account. Also, if you have it kind of like a hilly area, one thing you can actually do even if it's not flat or it's maybe too steep for you to do a normal garden bed in. You can look at doing some small terraces with like raised beds where they're raised on one side, and that can really help, especially if the slope that you're doing it on is a south-facing slope. One thing about this picture I want to point out too, this is using like hay mulch. This is actually early spring, but you could do the same thing in the fall, which is basically providing insulation to plants. In this case, lettuce is somewhat cold tolerant, but it's not like frost tolerant. So for us, this is primarily to help them cope with wind and other things, to help preserve more heat around the plants and not lose as much temperature as if they would if they weren't mulched heavily like that. The more that temperature is cool, the more important that sunlight is, because it affects the temperature. So other things to consider about temperature: some crops, fruit, mature best in cooler temperatures. Greens like kale, collard greens, pretty much any brassica is going to do. Broccoli, cabbage, Brussels sprouts especially, are going to do much better in colder temps. For one reason is there's not going to be as much insect pressure. Insects tend to thrive in heat, and when it gets cooler, they slow down and often just kind of disappear. Their life cycle is kind of over for the season. And so obviously a plant that doesn't have any insects eating it is going to thrive more than a plant that has a lot of insects biting away at it. So that's one reason. But the other reason is just their kind of preferred temperature that they like growing in is ideal for the fall. So some crops that do well in the fall: peas in particular do really well maturing in the fall. Greens like spinach and a lot of other greens like Asian greens, and mustards, bok choy, tatsoi greens, those kind of things, arugula, those all do really, really well in the fall. It's important though to note that as the temperatures drop, as your average temperatures get lower, the growth of the plant will slow, and particularly as it gets consistently colder, including having like frosts at night. Even if you have frost tolerant plants, they will at some point grow slower once they have the frost, even though it does have some benefit for them, particularly in terms of the flavor of things like kale, Brussels sprouts in particular. So it's important to keep that in mind when you're looking at your planning your timelines, and I'll talk about that in a minute, some planning factors you can put into that consideration. All right, so temperature. As I said, you have to adjust your dates for the slowing growth of the plants on the tail end of the growing season. So it's usually about a 2-week adjustment. That's a good kind of general rule. However, it will depend upon lots of things like what is the actual temperatures that you have. Are you doing anything like using a wind block or heavy mulching, or even like row covers for season extension? Those will extend even further into the later in the year when your crops may be able to mature until. So I want to talk real quick about season length. This is a thing that most people look at for kind of their primary growing season in the summer, but it kind of applies here as well. So your season length it's a difference between two dates. The first is the last average spring frost date in the spring, and the second is the first average fall frost date used in fall. It's important to note these. The key to these words is average, because there can be large variances in microclimates. There's a large variance in our area because our microclimate here is very, very different than even 5 miles in a different direction, let alone 10 or 20 miles. We're west of Roanoke about 20 miles, but Roanoke is a wide, rather deep valley at about 1,000 feet elevation. We're at 2,500 feet elevation in the mountains. So we get a lot of wind, we get cooler temperatures, we get snow when they don't there. In the summer, it's close to 100 there this week, and we're only getting up to 90, which is really hot for us. So there's like a 10-degree on average, about a 10-degree difference in temperature. So if I were to just take the dates I got for Roanoke, which is like the closest big city, they wouldn't be correct. They're different here. It's like 2 to 3 weeks different. So check with your neighbors or maybe an ag extension agent. But the big one that I found is most beneficial is people who have grown in that area before. They have more local climate data from experience, so check with them. So your season length is going to be the difference between those two frost dates. This is going to be particularly important in whether you can successfully grow long season crops like some winter squash and pumpkins, certain kinds of long season cabbages aren't as much a factor because they can grow they can survive frost. But anything that is killed by frost, if you have a days to maturity of 120 and your season length is 120, you got to be on the ball in the spring to get it planted like early, and you won't be able to plant in your fall garden, obviously. So your fall garden is primarily going to be things that are shorter season lengths or that can survive and tolerate frost, or that you're using season extension to help them tolerate frost. So let's talk about some planning factors here. So the first thing is going to be we just talked about, which is frost dates. A lot of people talk about, what zone are you in? It's important to note that the USDA plant hardiness zone map is actually for perennial plants. So it's important to know your zone for any perennials you might be growing, but for any annuals, which is the vast majority of vegetable crops in the garden, you have to know your first average fall frost date in order to plan when you can plant, like when's the latest date you can plant your crops for your fall garden, okay? So we talked about those. All right, so let's use an example here of how to figure out your lead times. So if you've got a first average frost date in the fall of October 15th, 5 different crops that are pretty common to be grown in a fall garden are broccoli, lettuce, peas, spinach, and turnips. And you can see the weeks before the fall frost date listed there. That's how many days, how many weeks before your frost date you should be planting them. In some cases, you may plant them in trays before you transplant them in the garden. So there's like an indoor planting date, which doesn't necessarily have to be indoors, but that's the date you plant it in a tray, and then the outdoor planting date is when you plant it in the ground. So most of these are just going to be direct seeded into the ground. So broccoli, you may start a month ahead in trays, and then 9 weeks before your fall frost date is the latest you'd want to get it planted in the ground in order to get a harvest. Now, you might be able to get a harvest beyond that, but that's kind of like based on the days to maturity, trying to get it to mature before you have frost. If you can get it close to maturity before frost, even with frost-tolerant plants like broccoli and other brassicas, usually that's good, because once you start having frost, the plant growth slows significantly. So if it's, a few weeks or more behind, then it may struggle to mature in that cooler weather regime where you're having frost kind of fairly frequently. Lettuce is not frost tolerant, so that's a really good one that you want to make sure you get in before your latest planting date. You can see here August 8th is the latest planting date, so it's coming up soon if you have this frost date. You can use row covers, low tunnels to cover things like lettuce to help when you have a frost forecast. So you can extend it beyond that, but these dates are assuming no season extension methods. Peas are actually pretty early because they take a long time to mature. They take almost 4 months to mature. So early July is actually the planting date. So if you are going to try to plant peas, you might want to look at doing a short variety and be ready to be able to cover them, run them on like a small short trellis that you can put a row cover over. Spinach is 8 weeks, so beginning of August, and then turnips 9 weeks before your frost day, which would make it and also kind of early August. So one of the reasons I do this webinar now is because, late July, early August is when you got to get a lot of stuff on the ground. So it's actually really imperative that you figure out what you want to plant, make sure you have the seeds, and get seeds if you don't have them, and get them in the ground so that, you can get them to mature before the frost, or be prepared to provide season extension methods, which I'll talk about in a bit, to protect them from frost so they can mature and you can get a harvest from them. A couple notes. These dates, as I mentioned, are without frost protection, and you could do successive plantings, which I'll talk about later, earlier in these dates. So these are like latest dates, the no later than date, essentially, without frost protection. So you can plant them before this, and for things like lettuce that you are going to want kind of continuously for salad and stuff, you can plant them every couple weeks leading up to this latest date. All right. I'm just going to skip this and come back to it. Now, so I've got two different pieces here, and I kind of piece them together. So I'm going to talk in general principles here about choosing varieties to plant. I'm going to give some specific recommendations towards the end. So the biggest thing to ask yourself when you're planting garden crops, whether it's spring or fall or whenever, what will you eat? I always recommend people experiment, but if you don't like broccoli, I wouldn't recommend going and planting, 20 or 30 row feet of broccoli just because you want to experiment, right? Experiment small scale on things that maybe you've tasted from the store that you don't really like. There's a lot of things that you buy in the store that, because they're harvested, a week or 2 or 3 in the past, by the time they get to you, they don't taste very appealing. 1, because they're not ripe. 2, because they've been in transit and have lost a lot of their vibrancy. They're just not as flavorful as when they're fresh. You might try growing some of those yourself, and you may find that you really like them. I've actually had some folks visit from California recently who had only had green beans cooked, and I gave them a fresh green bean and had them eat it raw, and they're like, "That's what a green bean tastes like?" I'm like, "Yeah, that's what a green bean tastes like." So it was like light bulb went off. They had no idea that green beans could be, sweet and tender when they're fresh like that. I recommend you prefer heirloom varieties, if for another reason, that there's so many of them, and there's just such a wonderful amount of variety in the heirloom varieties that are out there. So, you might have hybrids that you use for specific reasons. I recommend looking at those potentially. If you are tried heirlooms and haven't been able to deal with a particular disease problem in particular, but other than that, prefer heirloom varieties. There's just so much great things to try out there. Optimizing production for your space. Pick veggies that'll grow well in cool temperatures. So things like greens, peas, and turnips are going to be really good things to grow. You can consider veggies that have multiple edible parts, like turnips have turnip greens. You can harvest some of the greens off of them and use them as cooked greens, and then also harvest the root later. Same thing for beets. You can use beet greens in salads when they're young, and then harvest the beet later for eating the root. Very important to consider the days to maturity or maturation days versus your seasonal length or your latest planting date. That's what that calculation we did before is all about. Give me one moment here. Just realized I have a slide out of order. Okay, one other category here, your layout. So a lot of this may already be determined, especially if you did a spring garden, but you want to orient your plantings towards the south to get maximum sun. Typically, this means if you're doing rows, that the rows would be perpendicular to the direction of the sunlight. If you do that, you want to make sure that you put your tallest plants in the back or the north side of, like, the northmost row. Put your tallest plantings so they don't provide shade to the other plants. Especially in a fall garden, you kind of want direct sun for everything. If you're planting in the spring, you might strategically engineer shade in your garden so that you can have things like lettuce not bolt as quickly, but that's not a factor in the fall. So you basically want to have your tallest stuff in the back. You want to minimize the amount of shade in your garden. And then lastly, consider companion planting to create synergy. There's a beneficial relationship between plants. I'll talk about some specific ones near the end of the presentation. And lastly, to make sure that you have adequate harvest, space to harvest. So don't, in particular, don't make your beds too wide so you can't reach into the middle of them easily. You don't want to step in your growing medium. You want to step only in your paths. You're only compacting the paths and not the growing space. All right, last are some variables. Let's get into this part. One thing you can do is successive plantings. I mentioned this earlier. I recommend that people basically don't stop planting the entire growing season from the spring through the fall. Not with everything, obviously, but a lot of things you can do successive plantings of. This is particularly important for things that you harvest. You're not harvesting fruit like a tomato or a pepper, but you're harvesting like the foliage, or you're particularly if it's a root crop, you're harvesting the root like a beet or something. Since you're taking the whole plant out, or even if you're doing something like cutting the top off a lettuce, yeah, it'll grow back, but it's going to take a while to grow back. It's good to have successive plantings that are spaced apart so that you essentially are able to continuously harvest, and you're not running out of stuff. Ideally, if you don't have to go to the grocery store, you need to have a continuous harvest in order to keep good food on the table for your family. So some successive planting principles: obviously, don't just plant once. Try to optimize the space you have available by planting again after you harvest the first crop in a specific space. And this is really important for any time you harvest a root crop like beets or radishes or something. Because you're pulling the whole plant out, you can immediately plant in that space again. So at a minimum, put some seeds in there. But if you can, think ahead, plan ahead, plant some stuff in trays. And then when you harvest a crop, you have stuff that's already started and you transplant into that space. And now you essentially bought yourself some extra time to condense the growing season for that particular crop within the overall planting, garden growing window. You can maximize your production through transplanting, like I mentioned. You're going to get more lettuce successive planting if you're planting them in trays and then transplanting the lettuce transplants into the garden than if after you harvest something you're transplanting seeds into the garden, right? Because you're giving them a several weeks head start before they get in there. So 2 to 3 weeks is a good measure for salad greens. Radishes are great to plant with a slow growing crop. You can essentially plant things closer than normal. Do a form of interplanting if you plant radishes, because most radishes only take a few weeks to get to maturity, unless it's a long growing radish like a daikon or something that takes a month or two. But you can basically plant something like lettuce or carrots or something and put radishes next to it, and by the time the radishes are ready, you pull them out. They really haven't negatively affected the other plants that you have planted right next to them, and then they're out of the way, and those other plants have gotten started, and now they're leafing out and consuming more of the space in the garden with their foliage, and it makes better use of more optimal use of the space in your garden. So to help you figure out both your planting, successive planting timing, as well as to tell you like how many successive plantings you can do, I built a succession planting calculator that basically you put in your first fall frost date. Say that 5 times fast. And then you put in your first planting date for each of these crops, and it'll calculate based on a planting interval that is kind of optimal planting interval. It'll determine your other plantings that you have to do, and then it'll also tell you when it's too late to plant anymore because of your fall frost and cold weather coming. So you can go to seedsgenerations.com/SPC, or I believe we have a link on the page to click over to that below the video. So just look for the link that says Succession Planning Calculator. You can click on that and go get that. And hopefully that's helpful for you to use to make succession planting easier. It's one of the things that I think if you can grow a lot more food if you do this on a consistent basis. So if you haven't tried it yet, please do. All right, let's talk about season extension. This is one of the things that most people think about when they think about fall gardening. You think about row covers and hoop houses and low tunnels and that kind of stuff. So let's talk about what season extension is, what it does, some different forms of it, how you might implement it. So season extension is designed to provide different degrees of frost protection, or to increase the growing area over a crop higher than it would be based on the ambient temperatures in a particular area. So you basically simulate a warmer growing environment, or produce a warmer growing environment in a small space over a crop that is not, it's more conducive to growing there than just the ambient air. Permeable fabrics that are used as row covers are the most common thing to use. You can also use plastic over hoops, or over a cold frame, which we'll talk about in a minute. Plastic provides more insulation than a row permeable fabric. However, it doesn't let water through. So fabrics, the big benefit of fabric is that it does let water through, as well as sunlight, while retaining some of the heat inside. And then traditional cold frames use glass, obviously, but you don't necessarily have to use glass. So glass and plastic, important. They need ventilation during the day if it's a warm day. If it's a cold, really cold day with a lot of wind, you don't necessarily need to ventilate them. Maybe just a little bit, like an inch or something. But you might have a frost one night, and then during the day it gets up to 65 or 70 and it's full sun. Well, it's going to get up to 85 or 90 in that covered environment if it's not ventilated, and it could detrimentally affect your crops. So you want to make sure that you ventilate appropriately, make sure that there's some cooling from air movement underneath covered areas like low tunnels, which is what you see here, or a cold frame. Using season extension, which I'll talk about specific methods in a minute. You can extend your harvesting into the winter and even through the winter, depending on how you do it. So let's talk about some methods. The first one most people don't think about as a season extension method is one that many people do, which is transplanting. If you grow seeds in trays, let's say indoors in the spring before it's warm enough to plant them outside, and then you transplant them in the garden, what you have done is effectively extended your season earlier in the year than you would have been able to do if you just planted seeds directly in the garden. So this is very common in the spring to extend the season. So I throw this in as a form of season extension because it's very common to use it in the spring. You can also use it with successive plantings, like I mentioned earlier. If you have seedlings in trays already growing, and then once you harvest your beets, for instance, and then you plant those seedlings into those spots, you've essentially bought yourself some time in the growing season for that crop of lettuce or whatever you're planting seedlings for. So that's the first and most basic form of season extension that does not require additional equipment or whatever. I'm assuming you have some trays to plant in. So frost protection types of structures. The first would be like a greenhouse or a high tunnel. This is a very simple DIY high tunnel that I made. It's kind of small one, but it's like 12 feet wide by about 20 feet long. It's made out of PVC hoops that are 20 feet long to make the arches. And I grew tomatoes in these. This was probably 8 or 9 years ago I did this. But I was able to grow tomatoes through about Thanksgiving in this small high tunnel. And we live in the mountains of Virginia where it gets cold, and we have even snow by that time, and let alone lots of frost. So having tomatoes in the fall is pretty awesome. Fresh tomatoes in the fall. And in something like this would allow you to do that. Cold frames provide frost protection and potentially heating as well. There's something called a hot frame, which basically has a heated element underneath it, or some people will actually even put basically the materials to make compost down in the ground or in a bin or something, and then add soil on top, and basically the heat from the composting action underneath is adding heat to the soil. So that would be a hot frame. But basically a cold frame is a covered fixed structure, typically a raised bed like you see here, And you can do it either with wood siding, like you see in the back of the picture, with some slants on it. And then I had a large piece of plate glass. It was tempered glass that was the cold frame was built to fit that. Or you can use a simple wooden frame and put plastic around it, like the one in the front of this picture shows. Or you can use something like this, which is using hay bales or straw bales as insulative sidewalls. And then you have a wooden frame that has plastic over it to provide sunlight access, but to retain the heat. So these are some examples of cold frames that you might use. Cold frames, I think, are most effective and most useful for in the spring when you want to try to get your crops acclimated. You're growing stuff in trays indoors and you want to get them acclimated to the outside. A cold frame is a great way to do that in a gradual manner. In the fall, what it does is it allows you to, if you're going to grow something into the winter, that's where growing in a cold frame is beneficial. And you can see in this picture on the left, I've got some kale growing in the back of this bed that, and it's hard to see, but there's some red lettuce that's in kind of in the middle. But with this cold frame, I was able to actually grow into and through a lot of the winter because I basically could just prop it open during the day when it was warm and close it up at night. And it protected it from frost. It gave it a nice warm environment. And so if you have like a raised bed, you can actually build a cold frame on top of it and continue growing that bed into the winter. So that's where a cold frame can be really helpful. Low tunnels can be fabric or plastic, typically over hoops. Depending on the crop, you can lay fabric right over the foliage if it won't break it. But having hoops does provide a little bit better, provide some separation between the foliage of the plants and where the fabric is. Plastic, you pretty much have to use hoops of some sort because plastic, when it comes in contact with foliage, often if it's a hot sunny day, it'll actually burn it because it gets really hot. So here's an example of some simple raised rows with some simple wire frames and plastic is put over it. On the right here, here's an example of a low tunnel inside of a high tunnel. And this is how Elliot Coleman up in Maine is able to grow through the winter. And he grows a lot of greens, lettuces and stuff to sell for restaurants and for home use. And his primary growing season is actually off cycle. It's in the winter in Maine because he's able to basically use this method of low tunnel inside high tunnel unheated greenhouses to grow cool weather crops all through the winter, even in Maine where they have, obviously very short days in the winter. So if you're doing row gardening, low tunnels are going to be the most beneficial type of application you're going to want to look at. The two main options you have are for coverings are fabric, and there's several different options, including varying degree of frost protection for those. Or plastic. If you're using plastic, I'd recommend at least 4 mil plastic. If you have a lot of wind, look at higher, maybe 6 mil plastic. Greenhouse plastic film is best. It's the most durable over time, but it's also much more expensive. So you can also just use the clear construction plastic you would get at like Lowe's or Home Depot for that. And then in terms of the hoop structures, you can use heavy gauge wire, like high tensile wire for like cattle fencing or something you might get at a farm supply store. You can use that. Or you can also use typically 1/2-inch EMT conduit, metal EMT conduit, which is galvanized. And you can buy a hoop bender that is sized for the width of your bed, like 4 foot or 6 foot. And then you can basically bend the hoops to make, and where you basically stick the EMT down in the ground and then you put your covering over that. And that's the most rigid, strong structure. So if you have a lot of wind, that's probably what you're going to want to look at. And then very important also, if you're using low tunnels, you want to make sure you adequately secure the sides so that they don't get blown off with the wind. And so at a minimum, you're going to want to use heavy boards or boards with some weight on them, like sandbags or cinder blocks or something, if you have any kind of significant wind. You can also bury them like at least one side under the dirt and the earth holds it down. And the other side that you have that you take off when you need to access the plants for harvesting or whatever, you could use boards or sandbags or something to keep the edge down. Typically, you're going to want the windward side more secured because that's the one that's more likely to get blown up. Though if it's not tight, it can actually get pulled up on the other side. So it's also very important to have the whatever the fabric is or plastic that's very tight against the hoops and there's not a lot of play. Any kind of play, once you have wind, it'll flap and it'll tend to want to pull up on the edges and undo what you have holding it down. So that's really important. All right, cloches is or cloche is, I think, how it's pronounced in French. The one on the right here, these little glass bells, is a traditional cloche, but on the left, you can improvise other ones. This is basically a covering for an individual plant. Another one I don't have a picture for here, we actually use mason jars, quart mason jars. I can't remember if it was this spring or last spring, to cover our asparagus. We had asparagus spear, the first asparagus spears that were coming out of the ground, and we were forecast to have a very, very cold, heavy frost, and they were going to get damaged. So we just put glass jars over the individual spears for the night, and then in the morning we went and took them off, and it worked great. So that's another example. And the last one I'll mention is that you can use a structure that acts as a heat mass as a form of season extension. So in this picture, you see a brick wall, presumably south is to the left in this picture. So you have its south-facing wall absorbing heat during the day. The bricks absorb the heat, and then at night they radiate it out. So you're going to have a microclimate in this flower bed right by the wall that is warmer than the surrounding area. So what they're doing here is they're growing, it looks like tomatoes in the back, peppers in the middle, and those are heat-loving crops. So doing this basically gives them a way to keep it warmer kind of later in the year in particular. And so this may be very beneficial thing to do for folks that live further north. You can use this as, and then you can also use row covers in conjunction with this. You know, a south-facing wall is also a great place to put like an attached greenhouse or partial hoop, where you can basically attach it to the structure, and then if it has like a brick or stucco exterior or something, can act as a heat mass. That's even more beneficial for the greenhouse because it can absorb heat during the day and then radiate out at night, and it can basically moderate the temperature fluctuations throughout the day. All right, so that's some season extension methods that you can consider and some tips on how to use them. We're going to wrap up here with some fall and winter crop ideas, so you can maybe have some recommendations to look for things to plant. Beets are fantastic, and they kind of do well all year, but they do pretty well in the fall. And they're relatively short season. You know, they're anywhere from like 50 days to maybe 70 days. So, you know, if you get them, depending on where you're at, when your frost date is, you know, if you plant them a couple months before your first fall frost, then you can get some nice beets in a relatively short period of time. Cabbage is great. It really likes the cold weather, in particular because most of the pests for cabbages decline in the fall, and so they like maturing in cooler weather. So you can, in a lot of areas, you can still plant cabbage, especially shorter season cabbages now, and get a really nice fall crop for cabbage. Carrots are another one. One thing about carrots is that the sugar levels in the root increase with frosts. In fact, you can leave carrots in the ground through the winter, and after the tops will get frosted and die back, and it will look like there's nothing there. But if you know there's carrots there, you can go dig them up in the winter, assuming the ground's not frozen, of course. And those carrots that you harvest after frost are going to be the sweetest carrots that you can get, because the frosting process increases the sugars in the roots. And this is actually kind of a general rule for a lot of different crops, including things like Brussels sprouts get more flavorful and sweet after frost. So you can kind of apply that across the board for things that are not damaged by frost. It's going to increase the sugar levels and make it a more flavorful vegetable. Swiss chard does really well in cool weather. Lettuce does great in cool weather, though it doesn't tolerate frost, so you'd have to cover it if you're going to have a frost. Kale is fairly frost tolerant. You have to have repeated very cold frosts, a lot of single-digit temperatures to actually kill it back. But, you know, if you've got occasional frost, you're going to have really nice kale into the winter. Peas don't tolerate frost, but they do very well in cool weather. Onions can tolerate cold weather as well and grow well in the fall. Radishes do great pretty much any time of year, but they do really well in the fall in particular. Spinach loves cool weather, doesn't like hot weather. So you're going to grow much better spinach in the fall than you do in the late spring and summer in general. And lastly, turnips are a great crop because they grow really well in the fall. They also have that sugar concentration after frost dynamic, like I mentioned with carrots. And because you can eat the greens with turnips, you got multiple edible parts, right? You can harvest the greens for cooked greens dishes, and then you can basically use the turnips in a whole bunch of different ways. They're actually great just raw, cut up. You can slice them up like you would carrots or something, and then eat them with like a dip or something like that. It's really tasty that way. But you can make you can use them basically like mashed potatoes, or even add them to mashed potatoes. There's lots of different ways you can cook turnips, and they're a really nutritious crop. Last thing here I want to mention, I did shortly mention companion crops earlier, but I want to make some specific recommendations about these. So some things that you can grow well in the fall and are also companions are beets, along with brassicas like broccoli, cabbage, or cauliflower. That's a really good one to look at. They tend to do very well. Dill, along with also brassicas like broccoli, cabbages, do very well together. Lettuce and radishes do really well together as companions. Turnips and peas, so you can plant turnips kind of at the base of your peas and have those have a synergistic effect on each other, more so than they would have if they were just growing alone. So those are some recommendations for companion planting pairings for your fall garden. We went through manually calculating, some examples of manually calculating your latest planting date for your fall crops. But to make the process easier for you, I built a fall garden planning calculator that basically you put in your fall frost date and it instantly calculates all of your latest planting dates for over 40 kinds of crops. So if you haven't already used this, you can click the link below the video to go there and get it, or go to seedsgenerations.com/FPCalc to get that. We do have a premium version of this that has more dates, including dates with frost protection added, and I'll tell you in a minute how you can get that as a bonus in a few minutes, so stick around. So what about the seeds? Obviously, you probably already have seeds if you planted a garden this year, but you might need more for your fall garden. So we want to provide heirloom seeds from our family to yours. To do that, we're having a fall gardening sale starting now, going through the weekend, so you can get seeds to plant for your fall garden. You can get some great discounts on selected seed varieties. And then if you want to get that premium fall planting calculator, which has additional dates for frost protection, it also is downloadable. So you can basically save it to your computer and print it out easier for reference in your garden clipboard or whatever. You can get that using the code Fall Gardening Sale 2021. For orders of seeds that are $40 or more, you get that premium fall planting calculator, which is a $10 value. So you can go to the link below the video. There's a little banner there, or go to seedsgenerations.com/fallgarden. And last but not least, before we go to the Q&A, we're having a fall gardening giveaway right now. And if you haven't already signed up, you need to go sign up. We're giving away a $50 seed credit. And it's not just a enter once and hope you win, but it's kind of a, you can increase your chance of winning by sharing it with friends and family. And particularly, you get a lot of points when other people that you refer sign up for the giveaway as well. So click on the link to go to the fall gardening giveaway, or go to this URL, seedsgenerations.com/fall garden giveaway, to enter if you haven't already. If you already entered, you can go find the email that you received afterwards to get the link to share your unique sharing link that will allow you to earn extra entries into the giveaway. All right, so it's time for questions. If you have any questions, please ask them now. If you can, please use the Q&A tab on the left of the screen. It's a green Q&A tab. Enter your question there, and my assistant Rachel will basically put those in order for me to start going through and answering. If you can't stick around for the Q&A, thanks so much for coming. Really appreciate you taking your time to join me for this training. If you have any questions later, or if you don't have time to ask them now, just send us an email. You can reply to any of our emails, in particular, maybe the one for the webinar that tell you when the webinar was. Reply to that, and then we'll get back to you with an answer. So on behalf of my wife, Shannon, and my kids, we'd like to thank you for joining us. But we'll go to get to questions right now. So I'm going to look at my reference sheet here and start pulling up the questions. And I'm going to take a quick break here to get a drink of water. So I'll be right back. All right, y'all. Please ask any and all questions. If it's even not about fall gardening, throw it out there, and I'll be happy to answer it. I'm really here to help you with whatever challenges you're facing, and maybe it's something in your summer garden right now you're facing. I can help with that too. But if you do have any questions about fall gardening, please ask those first. I'd like to get as much of the content around fall gardening into the Q&A here while we have time, and then if there's other questions, we can handle those afterwards. So all right, pulling up my questions here. All right, first is a question from Bethany. Make sure my mic is on here. Okay, yeah, I'm not muted. That's good. She says, what types of pests are a problem during the fall season? Well, I have good news for you, and the first answer to that is in general, pests decline as temperatures cool. You may actually see it quite noticeably right when and it's usually not until September, but when you have your first kind of like that period where the early fall, when you have like, it goes from being like 80s, 90s to maybe like in the 70s, and it's real dry, you may actually notice that the pest pressure declines some. So that's kind of the first answer, is that generally pests are going to decline in the fall. Typically, the ones I think you're going to be having the biggest problem with are going to be, and this is from my experience, again, there's probably other people that have, because you have different pests are predominant in different areas. Where we have cabbage worms quite a bit, and since we grow cabbage in the fall, obviously we have a problem with that. Probably worse than cabbage worms, though, are harlequin bugs. Then they often stick around. They linger a little bit longer than other pests for some reason. They're maybe a little more cold tolerant. Harlequin bugs they're kind of the shape of a stink bug, but they have patterns, basically like an orange and white and black pattern on their shell. So if you see a bug that looks like that, that's a harlequin bug. They can be very hard to get rid of. They typically like greens, particularly brassicas, like kale seems to be their favorite, but also broccoli and other stuff like that. So the follow-up question naturally to that is often, well, what do you use for pest control? Well, several things depending upon your budget and what you want to do. The best broad spectrum organic pesticide that I know of that we use is called Pyganic. It is certified organic. It is based on pyrethrins, which are a natural compound that occur in some plants. And but it's not cheap. I just actually bought a new bottle. I mean, it'll last me into next year. And I spray, once or twice a week for some plants that we're having pest problems with. But it was like $80 for something that's going to last me for close to a year of gardening. You can get smaller quantities sometimes, but it's more expensive per unit. So Pyganic is the name. If you have the budget for it, I recommend that. It's kind of like the best broad spectrum. If you have problems with worms, BT concentrate. BT stands for Bacillus thuringiensis. That is a bacteria that kills worms. Any cabbage worms, corn worms, any tomato hornworms are fairly easy because they tend to be few and far between, and you can find them if you can find them camouflaged amongst the foliage. They're big and fat, and you can take them off. And if you have chickens, feed them to the chickens, and they love them. But in any kind of worm, BT works with. That's also organic. It's just a bacteria. Let me think here. Also, you can use diatomaceous earth, nicknamed DE, diatomaceous earth, DE, which is a white powder. And you can use it in various forms. Since it's a powder, you can sprinkle it on plants. So the problem is it tends to get washed off when you have rain. We actually have a recipe for an organic pesticide using DE and neem oil that's on a recipe. So if you go to the search, I go to our website and search for neem, Neem, neem oil is probably the easiest way for it to come up, or just search for pesticide, and that there's a blog post with a recipe for that, and it explains not only the ingredients and the mixture ratios, but also like why it works. So and those are fairly inexpensive, and you can use DE for a lot of things. You can also use neem oil for a lot of things. Neem oil is an insecticide. It's also a fungicide. So you can like spray trees that are having fungal issues with it. There's a lot of different uses for both of those two compounds. So, but that is a pretty effective pesticide for things like squash bugs and things like that. So check that out on our website if you haven't already. Okay, next question from Joan. She says, we're in Tucson, Arizona, and it is hot, capital letters, H-O-T, hot, and will remain so through September, then be really nice in October and possibly through the end of the year. My concern is the heat now, and for so long is it possible to plant for a fall garden with it being 100 degrees out? So good question. If you live in the South or in the Southwest where it's a lot hotter, you basically have an extended summer growing season. Your fall growing season is pushed back a couple months from most people. So the hardest part about really warm areas is if you don't have a frost date, which typically is only in the tropics. But if you have an average frost date that's somewhat accurate, you get the fall planting calculator and plug that in there and see what it gives you. That's the best way to determine the right planting dates. What I would recommend for you to try to get the most out of it, if you can, is try to start your plants as seedlings in trays, maybe indoors in a cooler environment, so that you're basically protecting them from the really intense heat that's still lingering in late summer if you live in a really hot area like that with a hot climate. So that's my recommendation. If you don't have a frost date, most likely you're in like South Florida or the tropics or something, and then essentially you kind of grow year round, and you're just growing based upon what stuff grows well when, right? So there's a lot of things you grow in the winter that other people might grow in the fall or the spring. So that's kind of another topic that you might do some more research on, but it's not the topic I'm going to go into detail about right now because we're talking about fall gardening in temperate zones. All right, so Kathleen asks, how do you combine and grow food in a smaller space? So you want to use various forms of interplanting. I mentioned it in this training in regards to radishes, planting radishes next to other crops because they grow quickly and you can get them out of the way. The other thing you can do is trellising. Anything that has vining plant growth, like cucumbers, put them up on a trellis rather than on the ground. That gives you basically more your growth vertically. I mean, it's still going to kind of come out away from the base of the plant some, but it'll give you more lateral space in your garden bed to grow next to them. So vertical gardening and trellising is a really good way to do it. The other one is using differential growth rate of different plants. So carrots grow pretty slowly. You can use lettuce. Obviously, radishes work with almost anything because they're so fast to mature. But if you planted carrots now, you could probably also plant something like lettuce, where it has to be something where the foliage does not get big really fast, because you don't want to like crowd out the carrots or whatever the thing that's slower growing underneath a canopy of foliage. So lettuce takes a while to get established. If you do the spacing right, by the time your lettuce gets full, then you harvest it, get it out of the way, and now the carrots have, they're medium size and they're maturing where they're more bushy, and then they have more room to bush out, for the foliage to branch out and leaf out in the area where the lettuce was. So that's an example of differential growth rates and growing more food in a smaller space. And then, of course, the other thing is you can always use container gardening. You have any herbs, put them in pots. It's great because you can bring, especially things that are frost sensitive, like basil. Basil doesn't like it below 40 degrees. So if you get even close to freezing, it's going to really, if not zap your basil, it's going to really make it struggle and it's going to stunt its growth. So putting at least some of your herbs in pots, that's a really great way so that you can keep them growing into the fall and winter. All right, Jennifer says, I like to grow organically. I live in Maryland and have lots of trouble with white flies on my brassicas. What can I do to combat those buggers? She says white moths. So white moths, those would be cabbage worm moths. They lay their eggs and then the worms hatch out and then they crawl around and eat the foliage. I mentioned this before, I'll just mention it again. BT concentrate, you can buy it in most gardening centers. You can buy it online. Just get a small bottle of BT concentrate, mix it in the recommended ratio with water, and then put it in a sprayer. I recommend a hand pump, not a hand spray bottle, because your hand's going to get really tired from doing that, but get one of those sprayer canisters. It's like a 1 or 2 gallon sprayer tank that has a handle on top that you pump up and pressurize the tank, and then it's got a hose with a wand on the end. Use that and spray all your brassicas thoroughly down. Make sure you get down into the top of the leaves. They typically like to eat the more tender leaves on the inside of the cabbage, so make sure you get in there and move the sprayer head around and make sure you coat it all really well. And that should, if you do that a couple times a week, you should see some pretty significant improvements in knocking back the worm population so that they're not eating your cabbage. Now that's killing the worms after they've hatched. I mean, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, as they say. If you've got brassicas that you can cover with a fabric row cover to keep the moths off of them, so not laying the eggs, then you prevent the problem in its entirety. But a lot of times you can't do that easily. So typically I just use kind of occasional or routine applications of BT spray. I don't have a name with this one, but it says, which fall veggies grow well in pots? Great question. Great question. A lot of people don't think about container gardening in the fall, but it's one of the best things that you can do for a lot of things, like I mentioned, with herbs, because you're going to want to use culinary herbs kind of repeatedly, continually. You can't really preserve. I mean, you can preserve them by drying, but there's a lot of stuff you want to use fresh, particularly things like basil or dill. So containers are a great way to do that. So I'd recommend always any kind of culinary herbs grow in pots. Things that are smaller that do well in cooler weather. So, a tomato plant's hard to move in a pot. I mean, you can grow them in a 5-gallon bucket, but they like hot weather. Peppers like hot weather. So they're not going to do really great like indoors and as the weather cools. But anything that grows cool weather. So, example might be Brussels sprouts. If you have a porch or a patio or something, you can grow some in containers. You got them right there when you want some. You go out and pick them. Greens that you're going to use on a routine basis for salads or smoothies or cooked greens or something. Obviously, any kind of lettuce, salad greens, arugula, that kind of stuff. But also kale, collard greens. You know, if you want to kind of scale back your growing and bring it closer to the house, essentially like do a container kitchen garden, I would look at things that you use on a regular basis that do well in cooler weather. And then it also says, so a follow-up question here was, can I reuse the soil from my containers to plant something else? If you've already got containers for stuff that is no longer in use, yes, you can. Though I always recommend adding good organic compost when you're planting. You want to have the area right around the roots of the plant, especially right away initially, to have really good growing medium so they can get established really well. This is from Jan in Tennessee. She says, can you do a small fall garden inside with grow lights? We have lots of wildlife here. So pest pressure in terms of deer and such. Critters. You can, but it's actually fairly difficult to do well because you have to have a lot of light and it can be pretty expensive. If you got a big basement space and you want to go all out and buy a bunch of grow lights and do it indoors, you can do that for sure. What I would recommend is just using season extension coverings to keep the critters out. So doing row covers, doing cold frames, those kind of things will keep the critters out. The only one that I think there might be an exception to is like if you have something like rabbits or squirrels that are small that are getting into your garden, you're going to still need to keep those out of the garden. Because if you are doing like row covers, for instance, like low tunnels, you're going to need to ventilate them on warmer days, and so they will be open. You might have to put up some chicken wire or something to keep them out, but depending on what type of pests you have, what type of predators, will determine kind of how you deal with that. But I would recommend using the season extension methods. I mentioned growing outside. If you've got different growing areas, the closer to the house, the better. As it gets colder, obviously, you want to kind of fall back to your kitchen garden, so to speak, is typically a good way to approach it. So hopefully that's helpful for you. Dina asked, does the fall planting calculator take into consideration the new extreme and unusual weather patterns? So no, it uses averages. So you will have to use your judgment to apply corrective factors for any differences in climate or weather patterns that you see. Typically, the published average frost dates for a particular location that the NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Agency, publishes, they're the U.S. weather system is under them. Those dates are based upon like long periods of time, like several decades, and it uses those for averages. But then when they publish them, they publish a 10% to 50% and a 90% number. So there you actually have an idea from most conservative to least conservative what kind of dates you're looking for, and typically it's going to be a 2 to 3 weeks in either direction. What I would recommend is going with whatever you feel is your comfortable level of risk tolerance, and then being prepared with things like row cover for when you have a frost forecast. Obviously always watch the weather and particularly temperatures. And depending upon your microclimate and how weather occurs where you're at, you may need to be more conservative. And I'll give you an example. Where we're at, we actually get lots of frosts that are not forecast. And the reason being is that we're in a mountain valley. The closest weather forecasting station is not in our valley, so they're not, giving weather for our microclimate here in general in our valley. But on top of that, we are in the middle of the valley, down by the creek, which is kind of the lowest point, and so cold sinks, and so we tend to get frosts much more frequently than our neighbors just up the road that may only be less than 50 feet elevation, 30 or 50 feet elevation difference from us, but because cold sinks, we'll get a frost here, in our growing spaces, and they won't. So we have to be much more on our toes and ready with row coverings and that kind of stuff. So typically, I keep an eye on the weather early in the fall, and I'm always looking for when it's going to be getting cool and close to having potential frost. But I'm much more conservative because of experience here. We often they might forecast a low temperature of like 40 and we can get a frost here, or 39, and so it can be up to 10 degrees difference where we're at. So that is a judgment call you have to make based upon all of your factors for your location and what you're seeing with the weather. But the best thing you can do really is make your calculate your planting timelines based upon whatever level, like a date that incorporates your level of risk tolerance, and then it's as a backup to have some season extension methods like row covers or plastic or something to put over crops that you want to save. Or if you just want to be ready to, harvest all the stuff that's going to get zapped by a frost, and you don't like things like tomatoes are hard to cover because they grow typically up on trellises. So that kind of stuff is hard to cover, but low growing stuff often you can cover and keep them growing even with frost. So hopefully that was a helpful explanation for you. One thing, last comment I'll make on this is that a lot of people don't realize this because although the narrative has changed from global warming to climate change, in most people's minds, they still tend to think of it as like temperatures are warmer. But the reality is that the primary determinant of major weather patterns and major temperature trends is the sun. The sun is where we get all of our energy from. So the sun, as the source of our energy, is the primary determinant. And the reality is that the sun is entering what is known as the grand solar minimum, which is the lowest point in about a 200-year cycle that's been seen through over the last several hundred years. Like, it's in recorded history. They've recorded it for maybe not a millennium, but like 400, 500, 600 years, and they've seen it over and over again. We're entering the grand solar minimum, so you can expect in the winter to have generally colder temperatures, and in the transition seasons you may have more extremes where you have like a frost that comes earlier, for instance. So a good example is last year. We had a late spring frost and we had a very early fall frost. Our fall frost date is like first or second weekend of October for the average date, but we got a frost on September 18th. And it was a bit disastrous because I was actually out of town and it wasn't forecast and nothing was covered, and it was bad. But I attribute that to the fact that we're entering the grand solar minimum nadir, or the low point of the cycle. And so in general, I think it's wise to be conservative and to plan as if there's going to be cooler temperatures. And that means that you should, if you want to keep growing into the fall and the winter, it's very wise, I think, to get the materials you need to be able to cover crops when you have a frost coming, to keep things growing longer, because it may come a lot sooner than you would expect. Typically your deviations from average in any given year are only going to be probably a week to maybe 10 days for like your earliest frost. But last year we had over a 3-week deviation that was early. And so we're preparing this year essentially for the same thing to happen. If it doesn't happen, great, but we're going to be prepared to do that so that if we do have cooler weather coming that might give us a frost, that we're prepared and we're covering our stuff with row covers so that we're not losing stuff that we could save through proper preparation and countermeasures using season extension. So that's all the questions I currently have. If you have any others, please put them in the Q&A as soon as you can, or the chat. I'm going to wrap this up because it is going a bit long. But I do appreciate all of your great questions and the interaction you provided. Really appreciate you taking the time to join me for this training. If you have any questions you think of later, please send us an email. We'll try to get those answered as soon as we can. All right, folks, don't forget we have our fall gardening sale going on now to help you get the seeds you might need for your fall garden and help you save some money. We've got some good discounts on selected seed varieties, and you can also get our premium fall planting calculator, which is downloadable, allows you to save it and print it easily, as well as some additional data like dates for season extension on it. You can get that for free if your seed order is $40 or more. Use code Fall Gardening Sale 2021 to get that. And also, we're having our fall gardening giveaway right now, so make sure you enter to win and share it with your friends and family to earn additional entries. All right, folks, thanks so much from my family to yours. We hope you have a great day and this was helpful to you. We look forward to serving you in the future with seeds, training, and other resources. Let us know if there's anything we can do for you, and we wish you a great fall gardening season. God bless.